Hello and welcome to the last anatomy video in our series here, which is the anatomy study of a foot. This will be the last one we look at before we actually dive into some of the methods of painting an actual figure. So we're still in study mode, although from all of the previous videos and from this one as well, hopefully we'll have developed um, some working method, be it in the amount of underpainting we do, or even in the drawing first preliminaries, and then how we're approaching laying down the paint, softening or glazing, and so that should have been what we've been practicing for the last several pieces of anatomy. Again, like we've said before, we don't really want you bouncing around too much and trying to do all these different approaches and techniques for finishing each of these different assignments, because then you're never really going to get strong and comfortable in one particular assignment. We really want you to focus on the method that you're really drawn to based off of either working process or perhaps the work that is created because of it, and then really try to focus on that as you develop your craft and develop your sensitivity for drawing and painting and seeing more nuanced colors. Again, this is going to be a little bit different than what we've done before, but it doesn't mean that you necessarily have to follow along with this actual process. Just follow along with whatever process you've been working on so far. And keep in mind, again, that this is just an anatomy study. So really try to limit it in your amount of time you're spending on it, because we want to build up your ability to capture essential information and capture just what we need to describe the anatomy and describe all the positions and get a good feeling for what's sitting in front of us with the model here. And noodling on this painting over countless sessions isn't necessarily going to advance it. We really want to just get the quickest, most direct means of describing our subject. So as you can see, I've toned the canvas here. It's just a burnt sienna and ultramarine blue, which is a common toning that I like to use because I can vary some of the temperature with it. I can also shift this to be a little browner overall or a little bluer overall and really get a nice either clean sort of off-white gray or a bluish tone or even a golden tone, depending on what I'm wanting here. What I've tried to mimic here is sort of an off-white gray that's similar in value to some of the toning that's going to be behind the model. It's just maybe a little bit light, and that's okay. Really just trying to kind of capture the color quality of some of the surrounding area, but just at a higher value, just to kind of disrupt the intense white. You can see I'm also trying to build in a little bit of texture in here, a little bit of variety. I don't want it to be completely smooth. Sometimes I do. That's what we'll see actually with the next video of several day painting of a figure. More classical approach with really clean toning. But this is actually how I would tone something that's going to be a little more direct, a little more alla prima usually. So where I have a little bit more texture back there that I may ultimately incorporate into the design. But also some of that variety gives me little markers that I can utilize to gauge some of my measurements off of and take plumbs and levels and angles. And so I'm continually sort of testing the canvas to see how much liquid is coming off, how much it's just thinner on there. I think it's Turpenoid. I usually use Turpenoid to tone the canvas and then Gamsol to paint with. But just lightly with a paper towel, testing and letting it set up. And so we've taken a break here, 5 or 10 minutes, and now I'm ready to start leaning into some of the actual painting here. I've got the model posed behind me. I've also done the picture-in-picture where we've adjusted the exposure so it's not completely blown out, so you can see a little closer to what I was actually looking at up there on the top left. And you can see it is quite a bit darker because as we have the camera adjusted so you can see some of the colors and values on my painting, the camera's not able to capture an accurate range of the subject behind us. So we have given you that picture-in-picture so you can see. And we also have a parallel palette here by David Casson on the left. This parallel palette is a nice portable palette. It's a little smaller, which is convenient to just toss in a backpack and go with you wherever you need to go. And it actually has a tripod attachment on the back, and that allows it to attach to a tripod and get up to eye level, or in the case that I have now, it really allows me to attach it to an extension arm, which can go directly attached to the easel here. And of course, the advantage of having a palette that's parallel to your working surface is that I can actually see the color and the value of my paint as it's going to appear on the canvas before I actually lay it on the canvas. And I have noticed a lot when students use palettes that are angled up towards the light source overhead is that they do end up tending to misjudge some of the values, and so they think they're mixing colors a bit lighter than they are, and then they lay it down and they realize how dark it is, and then they end up trying to dump a bunch of white in there to compensate. And so ultimately what happens is either the values tend to migrate towards a really mid-value range in their painting, or they just end up getting really kind of chalky, washed out values here. So I'm just building up a basic scheme of my foot here, trying to get some major angles. You notice I've skipped some of the initial kind of box and anchor and scheming steps from the drawing year that we've explored. I would certainly recommend still doing some of that, especially if you ever at any point find yourself struggling with more proportion issues, is to switch back and really make sure that your length and heights are accurate before even advancing to a scheme. I see students, especially in the program here, they've gone through the drawing year and then they tend to get pretty confident because they've passed the drawing year, and then as soon as they get to painting, they skip all of those drawing steps that we've gone through and they try to jump right into a more experienced way of painting like this, jumping right into some of the angles. But you have to keep in mind that this is backed by years and years of a lot of practice and a lot of sketching from life, building up my visual acuity to be able to take angles of lines as well as compare those angles to the length of the angles to get proportions and to make sure that that locks into all the other angles that are being built up. That requires a lot of practice, a lot of sketching from life, a lot of measuring before I'm able to do that more fluidly and quickly like this. And it was years before I could do this. I was always, and I still consider myself to be a rather slow painter, because if I'm given the opportunity, I would like to do all of that measuring. And it's only by force of necessity that I speed up. And keep in mind that I never speed up faster than accuracy allows. If I find that I'm doing this and somewhere I missed a major proportion, I slow down and I go back and I do all the measuring that I need to do to get it right. And I strongly recommend that that's how you approach this, is do as much measuring as you need to get it right, especially in the beginning. If we're doing an anatomy painting study of a foot or a leg or a hand or whatever, and your drawing is off on it, well, it's not going to look like that piece of anatomy you're studying, and then it ends up just being kind of wasted time. And if your goal is just to be pushing paint around, you might as well be doing a color study where you can focus on actually developing a skill without having to think about the drawing. Because here we're having to think about drawing quite a bit to get it right. I made sure that my scheme and proportions and angles were fairly accurate before I start to lay in here with this open grisaille that I'm doing. So keep that in mind. Do as much measuring as you need to do. I tend to find that students get too confident and don't do enough measuring, and then there just ends up being a lot more problems later on. As soon as they're given the option to paint, all of that slow, careful drawing that they used to do just goes kind of out the window, and then things go way too fast. See here I just took a level there to see the level of the heel compared to the level of the toes. Even at this stage I'm trying to do little tiny fine-tune adjustments to the angles in the drawing. And I'm working right now with a very large bristle brush. It's a bristle brush filbert, and that's allowing me to do some nice broad um, scumbling here to get some of my underpainting here, and also to do some of the fine lines. And even right now, just like with drawing, I'm suggesting some of the volume of form by allowing my open grisaille to follow some of the contours of the form with and across the form as I slowly build up little pieces of value here. And I will limit how much time I spend on this stage here. I've seen students get kind of lost in the underpainting stage. It's sort of a comforting stage for some students because it feels so much like drawing that they end up wanting to kind of linger here for an hour or even a couple hours, and they just don't really have a lot of time to do the painting. And we have to keep in mind that at some point we're going to have to move forward with the painting. And that's not to disregard what I've mentioned earlier about accuracy, the whole drawing thing, and that's a miscommunication I think that some students end up encountering. Is when I'm encouraging efficiency and speed, but also encouraging accuracy, they don't know how to reconcile the two. And what I typically recommend is that the reconciliation should occur in the volume of information that you put in your painting. A painting doesn't have to be super complex to be correct. It actually can be very, very simple with a very, very limited amount of information. Volume of information never has any bearing on accuracy of information. And so I think the problem that students have is that they spend all of their time loading their painting with information instead of spending their time measuring. And as a result, they just end up with a ton of information that's all off a little bit instead of having a little bit that's done really well. And if we're trying to limit the drawing stage of a painting like this to, like in this case, the first 10 or 20 minutes, then that requires that we set aside some of our desire or tendency to render out tons of little bits of information and instead focus on getting statements down which are very accurate and very precise. And then if there is time, we can build up a little more information like I'm doing here, getting a little bit more value adjustments, breaking down some of these angles a little bit more to get a little bit extra information. But time should never have any bearing on the accuracy of your painting or drawing. It should only have a bearing on the volume of information that you build up. And so the volume of information that you put in your underpainting, when we're talking about a brief study like this, the volume of information that gets put in the study should directly be dictated by how quickly you're able to get accurate information on there. Not how quickly you can just throw all the information on there. There's no set rule anywhere for how much underpainting you need to do, unless maybe you're going to be doing a glazed painting, in which case you need to do as much information as you intend on the final in this underpainting. But for something like this, once I reach a stage like this and I still have some time before that first break timer goes off, it's kind of just like a bonus time for me. I get to reinspect, all of my painting, refine it a little more, try to make things perhaps a little bit more accurate, and then just sort of add little bits of information as I desire, and get it into the kind of the noodle stage here, so that I can set myself up more for the painting stage. But it's all just sort of bonus time right now for me. And if your entire time is just spent getting, that basic scheme measured correctly, then that's fine as long as that scheme is correct. That's really all you need to be able to launch into some of the later stages of painting. But there's nothing worse than having it all measured wrong and then laying all your color on top of it and then really seeing how wrong it is and then having to obliterate all of the work you've done, which I've seen happen quite frequently. Keep in mind this video is being shown at real-time speed here, so we're looking at a little over 2 hours for this painting, which translates into a break every 15 or 20 minutes or so. I'm doing a little bit of edge modulation in there. Just taking a dry, clean paper towel that I've rolled to a point to get a fine detail, and I'm breaking up that form shadow along the toe there. I treat this underpainting stage with a lot of push and pull. It's really easy to lay down just a little too much with the brush, but that's not a big deal because you can just use the paper towel and spread it all out and get a nice even coating in there, and then instantly have a large passage that's coated with some value instead of slowly building up the entire painting with a lot of dry brushing and scumbling like we did in the master copy assignment. This allows us to go a little bit faster because we can use that paper towel to just spread over large areas. But notice I won't do that everywhere. I won't completely smooth everything out. I'll actually opt to leave, in many cases, some of this variety showing through underneath in this underpainting, because if it comes down to me leaving any passages of the paint film open later on, I would like a little bit of variety showing through, and that little variety translates into a more natural feel. So now that I've laid down that foundation pattern of light and dark, I am getting to explore the anatomy just a little bit more. The columns of the foot, the rounded qualities of the heel. Just letting my brush kind of follow some of these anatomical forms, much like we would with the anatomy drawings from the second term of the drawing. Again, I'm not in any rush here, so I'm making more careful decisions at this stage, especially when I get this much on here and there's still some time left. My goal is never really to load the painting with a ton of information if I'm doing this directly. My goal is more to ensure that the subtle qualities and transitions and of values and angles are more accurate and a little more sensitive. That to me ends up being more important, and that actually helps also to describe the volume of the form and the structure of the anatomy a little more than just tossing a bunch of details on there. And so I'd rather spend my time right now coaxing this out a little more if I can, trying to make really delicate, gentle marks, holding my brush at the very, very back. That allows for the softest touch. And I'm slowly building up the values here to be closer to what we actually might consider a poster study to be. Even though, a lot of this is going to get covered up, it all adds to my knowledge and understanding of what it is I'm looking at, so that when I switch over to utilizing color, I'm able to have a better understanding of how all of that will pan out with color. It allows me to switch to my red, yellow, and blue puddles a little more easily. Now I do have my palette arranged here, similar to the way I've had it arranged earlier, where I have groups of red, yellow, and blue. The primary difference right now is that my lightest light, red, yellow, and blue, are not mixed. So I do just have white there, so I'm going to have to use some white in this. But I'll still carry over some of that understanding and that idea, that desire to use just my red, yellow, and blues whenever possible. And then that will make stronger, cleaner colors because of it. I can render a lot of what's up there without having to use much white at all. Right now I'm just trying to explore and figure out some of the background colors so that I can key this background color, or I can key the foot to a bigger, broader color. So I'm trying to lay in and get this background kind of greenish tone, and trying to lock into the value first, and then I just isolated right there. I isolated the color. So I noticed that it's too blue, and I'm digging into some of the yellow and red a little bit more, and trying to lock into a little bit closer the color that's back there. It's more of a warm green, more yellow, more red in there. And even though I say warm there, it's kind of a casual slip from my previous thinking of painting, which was in terms of warm and cool temperatures. But now so frequently, I don't paint with light sources that are shifted noticeably blue or noticeably cool or noticeably warm, and thus the relationship to the shadows isn't really as following the rule of warm light, cool shadows, cool light, warm shadows. And so it forces me to have to actually observe a little more carefully and paint what's really there. When I'm working under a lot of white lights quite frequently, or diffused skylights, which are more of a balanced color temperature. And so by now, when I refer to a color like a green, for example, as needing to be a little warm, that just translates typically into meaning it needs a little more yellow and a little more red. And that the little more yellow, a little more red is actually what my brain is thinking when I lay something down. It's I have a lot of students who will look at a color and say, oh yeah, it needs to be warmer, and then they just dip into a brown or just any yellow or any red to try and do it, and it's not quite a precise enough method of thinking of how to modify the color. It ends up resulting in colors that are more dead and unclean than they want, usually lower in chroma, a little more muddier. Whereas when I look at a color and say, oh, I identify that it still needs to be in the green family, but it needs to be more of a yellow green or more of a low chroma green, that really clearly dictates how much of what I'm going to add. If I have a blue green and it needs to be more of a yellow green and maintain the same chroma, well then I just add yellow and more of the green. If I notice that it needs to be, if it's a more dull green, a more brownish green, then that means it's a lower chroma, and thus it's going to need to have some yellow added to it, but also some red added to it. So it's a more precise, sort of more full way of conceptualizing color. When you identify a color and you see the change that needs to be made, instead of just saying it needs to be warmer or cooler, which kind of neglects some of the chroma and kind of neglects some of the family issue, try to say, well, what is the color I see versus the color I have laid down? Does it need to be more red, more yellow, more blue, and how much of each of those do I need to infuse into it? So I feel that the color I have behind the foot is close enough for me to move forward. So I'm going to lay in now with some color of the actual flesh tone. I just laid a stroke down that I must have picked up a little bit of that green blue. You can see my blue sort of sliding down my palette, and it was so wrong and so far off what it needed to be that you can see I actually went out of my way to really wipe it clean before I move forward. I don't want to start my color off by contaminating it with such a wrong color family in chroma. So here we go. I'm locking into this lighter value red, yellow, and blue up top, and I'm using that to shift around my red and yellow and blue to try and get the correct color laid in there. That's a little better. And when I'm trying to do this, I don't necessarily think too much in terms of I'm going to start with a lower chroma and build some color on top of it, or I'm going to start with higher chroma and neutralize it and knock it down. I mean, that is one way to think of things to allow for a more kind of united style. But my approach typically tends to be to adjust my reference and my lighting to be whatever I actually want to be when I paint it, and then just try and paint it as accurately and as directly as I can without trying to rely on any formulaic build-up processes, especially if I'm trying to have a painting be very direct and very quick. I don't necessarily want to have to go back and revisit and remodify colors unless I absolutely need to. If they're wrong enough to require reworking, then I'll do that. But otherwise, I'd really like to just lay down something that's as accurate as I can right in the beginning here. And so you can see I'm trying to just lock in still to some of these colors here, just get the right chroma. I don't want things to be too colorful here. So I laid down that blue. That blue is the wrong family. I loaded it heavily with yellow and red, and now I'm trying to mix right on top of that to get a little closer to the right color. You can kind of think of color, especially in this early stage here, as being very moldable, very flexible. If you lay down a color that's, as long as it's in the right value, if you lay down a color that's not quite right, we can just pile more color on top of it and really get, shape it in a way like we could shape clay. Just shift it little bits red and yellow and blue, however we need to modify that color. And that allows us to get a lot more variety on there. It allows us to be not so timid when we lay it down, so that the colors are going to be stronger and cleaner overall. Once you lock into this initial big puddle that you deem to be relatively correct, it becomes pretty easy to just modulate it and shift it around. But you should spend quite a bit of time locking into that puddle initially, because that's sort of the basis for accuracy for the rest of what we do here. And it's really important also, not just getting the right color family, but also keying into the right chroma. I see that that does become an issue sometimes because the way that chroma is keyed ultimately determines how subtle and believable something is versus kind of how garish something is. And this is something that we've mentioned before, that if your value is pretty close to accurate and your color family is pretty close to accurate, then you can shift colors within an area as long as you're staying in the same chroma range, and it'll look pretty natural. Laying in some shadow there. Picking up some blues and purples at the halftone, so I'm starting to lay some of those in at those core shadows where the form starts to turn from light to dark. And you can see I'm just modifying that kind of greenish purple puddle to get warmer and redder and sort of a richer brown just by adding a little more red and a little more yellow. By keeping it on top of the same puddle, it stays close to the same chroma, just a little more chromatic, but it looks like it's keyed a little more appropriately than if I were to start with a whole brand new puddle. Right now, I'm kind of thinking of this almost in terms of notan, like we would with drawing. Again, reinforcing, re-examining my shapes of light and dark, but adding color to my painting while I do that. And so it's going to get me a little closer to finding the right drawing also, because I'm not completely neglecting drawing now. I'm not just mindlessly filling in the lines that are there. I'm actually, re-examining the drawing and trying to get a little closer to the correct drawing while I start to key into some of these correct colors. Notice I need to get a little darker than what I was before, so I dug into first some of the burnt sienna to the right, and then that was a little too dark, so then I pulled back to some of the cadmium red medium there, and then added some colors to modify that. You'll find that it's actually more appropriate to dip into the colors that are just adjacent in value, just a step lighter if you need to go lighter, just a step darker if you need to go darker. And that will actually allow you to achieve much more subtle shifting in values. And I know that does become a challenge for a lot of people because we're so sort of trained to automatically jump to something really, really light, such as a white to lighten things up, or something really, really dark, such as a black, or maybe an alizarin, or an ultramarine blue to darken things. And that can tend to blow our mixture out. Not only will we lose the value pretty significantly, we'll lose all that subtlety of value, but it could change the color quite a bit. And it was brought to my attention because so frequently I would see students adding such a dramatically dark color like alizarin or like ultramarine blue to a mixture such as this that's maybe a mid-value or even a little lighter than a mid-value, and they're often dipping into those colors without any regard for their color. And I'll say, oh, well, why did you use alizarin for this mixture? Why did you use ultramarine blue for this mixture? And the response is, oh, I needed a dark color. I needed to darken the puddle. And typically it's never considered more than the idea that, well, that's a dark color, so if I throw that into my puddle, it'll be darker. As opposed to, well, I needed a slightly darker red to go a little darker, I needed a slightly darker blue to go a little darker, and maintain a blue or maintain a red. Usually that color idea is absent from that decision-making process. And so what I typically suggest to try to check yourself, try to avoid that, is that if you find yourself doing that, if you realize that you're dipping into a puddle or a group of red, yellow, and blue that is more than the adjacent step, so more than the red, yellow, and blue directly lighter, directly lower, you should actually just start with a whole new puddle. And that will actually keep your values cleaner and will help you think about color right at the forefront again. If you think you really need a color that's that much darker or that much lighter to modify your puddle, well, you should really be starting with a whole new puddle. And that will keep your color cleaner and richer and juicier than just trying to take a light puddle like this, for example, and throwing your darkest darks in there. But that method's really going to require you have these large puddles like I've got on the palette there. I started with a ton of color. Even in the beginning of mixing that giant puddle on the left, you'll notice I just kind of had smeared all of the colors together and even made kind of a neutral set of colors in there, and that's actually not a bad method of working. There's nothing wrong with mixing a ton of color on there and starting with something that's a little more grayish, especially when we're dealing with human flesh tone, because in most situations human flesh tone is rather low chroma. You know, it's not a fluorescent orange traffic sign up there. It's a really low chroma orange kind of flesh tone, and so often it's more effective to start with a more neutral version of something like an orange, um, and then add some additional chroma into it, like I did earlier. So you can even see here, I started with a sort of lower chroma flesh tone on the bottom. Then I added a little bit more yellow, a little bit more red. That juiced up the chroma just a little bit. And I laid that on, and I decide from there, is my chroma correct? Is my color family correct? Is my value correct? Then shift it as needed. The brush I'm using for a lot of this right now is a rosemary comber. So it is going to give me some more looser brush strokes, even though that's not necessarily what I'm thinking about right now. But I should say that this is an older comber, and I don't necessarily take care of my brushes and treat them as well as one should. And so my combers typically go through several life stages. In the beginning, they start out very soft, very gentle, good for softening, good for delicately laying on paint. And then they go through a slightly stiffer stage, which is right here, where it's still fairly soft, but the whole brush set of hairs is a little more firm, and that's a lot better for paint loading. You'll notice it's not coming to quite as crisp of an edge as I'm mixing the paint on here, but it doesn't really matter because this is just a sort of a big broad lay-in of color. And then eventually they get even stiffer than that and typically much more splayed, and I use that for edge modulation or scraping into the paint as I need to, creating various textures in the painting. So I'm still not thinking necessarily in terms of anatomy. I'm still trying to just lay color down very impressionistically. Just closing my eye, or not closing, squinting my eyes, or squinting and also relaxing a little bit, just trying to see my subject as a set of floating color blobs. I just want a really strong color foundation before I start thinking really intensely in terms of the anatomical quality, at least for this particular demonstration. If you're having issues with color, then this tends to be a better approach, because it's, after that initial notan, it's really thinking of color right at the forefront, and then coming back later to subtly build on the anatomy there. I decided that that puddle was so large and so diluted already that it was getting difficult to hit the chromas that I need, which we'll find this happening at super, super light values. And so I found it easier to actually just scrape that whole puddle of paint off and start with a new set of color. I recommend doing that whenever you have to start dipping into your particularly lighter values, or particularly higher chromas, so that you don't end up wasting as much paint. I could have gotten here eventually with that previous puddle, but I would have had to lay so much paint into there that I would have probably ended up needing to lay out more paint to complete the painting. So it was easier in this case to just strip that little bit of color down and then lay right on top of it. Now, depending on how thick you want to paint, it might not matter to you. If you look at some painters, Van Gogh, Monet, or even like contemporary realist painters like Scott Burdick, who really lays some paint down there. If you're after that thicker buildup of paint and that more textural quality to the paint application, then you should just get in the habit of just building on top of those puddles, really laying down a lot more paint and then just digging into more of your puddles and really slamming more paint in there, because you can manipulate the color. Even if you have a large puddle of something that's very neutral, you can push it a lot more chromatically as long as you increase that volume of paint.
it's all about a ratio. We're just talking percentage of influence here. Percentage influence of red versus yellow versus blue. And if you're just not hitting the color, which I see quite frequently because people tend to get a little timid, it just requires us to shift those percentages, get higher amounts of the color that you need to push it into the color that you want it to be. Really isolate your subject, really try to identify what is the correct color, and then lay it in there more and more and more until you've really changed and shifted the color of that puddle. But again, if you don't want much paint buildup, you're going to need to do more scraping and starting new fresh puddles and really getting just the right amount of paint volume on your brush to create the texture that you want. In something like this, particularly quick studies that are going to be an hour or even just a couple hours, I often don't have a lot of time to contemplate really sensitive brush application of my paint, so I really do just tend to get in the habit of throwing more and more color down there until I just push the color where it needs to be and then slam it up there, instead of the sort of delicate contemplated way of applying paint to get a subtle range of edges and interesting paint application. Edge quality is good to think of, but I don't want to have to spend so much time thinking about brush application that I'm not able to complete a study like this. And I save that more contemplated brush application for either a specific study or for a time when I have more time with the model to be able to sort through all of that. Just trying to restate that background. If I put the background into a little more color context, then the colors of the foot will have a little more correct context. And not just color, but value too. Notice I'm deepening it there. And again, in a study like this, just as I mentioned before, I'm not necessarily thinking as much about brush application and how the paint is laying down on the canvas to create some of the effects that I might in a more finished work. In specifically the background being really, really thin and then the foreground being more solid and built up in an area of interest. That's fine if you can manage it, but I really want to focus more on color in this case. And so my background may be a little heavier, and that's fine for a study like this. But I don't want to try to latch on so much to a piece of brushwork that I like, in this case, that I'm too timid to throw down enough color to shift the color where it needs to go. And unfortunately, I do see this quite a bit in class, especially for those students who are studying a more direct method of painting, where brushwork really becomes the soul of the work they're doing. They lay a stroke down there and they just really love how it was laid down, just the quality of the paint application and the mark that's made. And they love it so much that they are very reluctant to go back and fix it if it's wrong. And unfortunately, you have to make it correct, but in the case of trying to maintain that quality, you would have to wipe that brush stroke off and then carefully relay it down with the correct value and the correct color and try to make the same brush stroke again. And that's that's really hard to do mentally, I think, when trying to learn how to paint very directly. It's easier to, I think, paint in the more traditional sense of just this overall color block in and smooth it out and then build on top of it and achieve the textural qualities and the brushwork that you want over an amount of time as you slowly approach the correct answer for color and value. And that's a safer way of working. But the more direct, it's just really hard to let go and remind yourself that, well, I made that brush mark once, so I can wipe it off and do it again. And so it's okay if I need to wipe it off. But like I said here, if you go through that mindset, that is a really slow, methodical, careful, observed thought process of laying down paint. And in a situation such as this, we don't really have the time to do that if we're going to also be thinking about correct anatomical structures and shape and correct values and correct color and trying to throw this all together at once. And so rather than carefully contemplate each brush stroke and wipe it off if it's wrong and try to relay it down. I'm just throwing more paint on, and adjusting the ratios of colored paint up there to create the correct color, the correct flesh tone as I manipulate this. It's kind of a different mindset, very much. We're at a new setting here. I've actually switched over to one of my Master's Choice brushes. It's one of the Badger blends from Rosemary, and I'm using this for more delicate marks here, but also for a little more paint load. These brushes actually, they're a little denser than the combers, and as such they are able to pick up more paint more easily than the combers do, which are kind of a little more on the flimsy side and really require a thinning of media with medium or terp to be able to get that paint really liquidy. Whereas these brushes are a little more firm. They're better at handling paint straight out of the tube, which is a little more of what I'm doing now, not as much thinning out. And so if I were to try to manipulate the paint with the combers, especially on a smaller brush like this, I would have a much harder time, and it's more difficult to control the exact volume of paint you have on your brush. This Master's Choice here, you can have a very delicate touch, get just a precise amount of paint on here, and really easily mold and sculpt the paint that's up there while laying down some new paint. Just trying to correct the shape again while I lay in a little more color. Some of these goldish green tones at the halftones here. I am starting to think a little bit more about anatomy now. You can see my strokes are kind of following at least the direction of the core shadows here, where the form turns from light to dark. And even though that's not necessarily thinking completely anatomically, that is still thinking more about how the light is striking it. That core shadow does reflect to a degree the actual structure of a form because it follows along the curvature of the form as it turns from light to dark. So notice as I just made that stroke which softened out the big toe into some of the other toes there, note how I didn't soften it by actually blending or flicking the paint at all. I softened it by creating a transition color between the light and the dark, which acted to soften out that transition without actually blending any paint. That is the preferred method of creating a transition if you want cleaner color and more intense color in an alla prima painting. We don't have the luxury of an underpainting where we can just sort of soften paint on top of it and subtly manipulate the color. You know, if you were to blend the light and the dark, you get a muddy color. So really, instead of flicking the paint or softening the paint at those intense transitions from light to dark, we want to try as much as we can to observe a color and mix a new color that acts as a transition between light and dark. And that is very, very challenging. I'll definitely admit that for a lot of people who are starting and just struggling with seeing the overall color in and of itself, you know, trying to ask them to see this tiny millimeter sliver of color between light and dark that facilitates the turning of a form, you know, that's a huge thing to ask, but it's something that you must learn. And if need be, get close to the model, get some good binoculars, whatever you need to do to actually be able to see that transition color, because it's pretty critical if you're wanting to create a rounded form without mudding up your colors. All the time I have students you know, try to just say, well, I don't see any color there, I can't see any transitionary color, and that's not really any of the debate. You know, I believe that those students cannot see it because they have not yet been trained to see it. You know, a lot of what we're doing here, especially after you learn all of these essential things on how to mix color and how to apply paint, the rest of what you learn is careful observation, better observation. The whole rest of your career you're spending trying to learn how to see better, see more detail, see more finely tuned detail. And that's what we're trying to learn here. And so we can't just brush off inaccuracy in a painting by saying, oh, well, I couldn't see that. That's all you're saying is, well, I haven't trained enough or haven't practiced enough, which is apparent. So you have to actually just get closer to the model, get close enough to see what you need to see. Binoculars if you're not able to physically move closer to the model, and then paint as much information, as much color notes as you can to facilitate this turning of form. Just be careful not to get too much into that information before you've laid down the basic color structure and value structure that we did earlier in this video. You see, that's where I'm going now. All of these transitions here from light to dark on the lower half of the foot, I'm trying to come in here and mix these new pieces of color to create that transition without having to blend my lights and my darks. And to some degree, you can kind of actually see on the palette what color is required to create that transition. If you've left your big puddle of dark and your big puddle of light, you can actually just mix a color in between them to see what's a good step between the two on your palette before you lay it up on the painting. Especially, you know, you have wet paint up here, you don't want to ruin too much of it or contaminate too much of it. So really try to figure it out on your palette if you can. Hopefully you're using a larger palette than I have here, in which case you can leave some of these puddles for a little bit longer and you can really figure out what is the correct little piece of color to transition between light and dark. You'll notice that I do more than just the one stroke each time here, and when I'm working really directly, I'm pretty adamant about one or maybe two strokes before going down and getting some new color and modifying it. Here I'm doing upwards of, sometimes 4 strokes before I go dip back into paint. And I want to clarify here the distinction between having 2, 3, 4 strokes with one paintbrush load and licking the canvas, which is a very common thing for students to do. And it's something I've talked a lot about in my classes. Really avoid licking canvases. It kills colors and kills values and kills edges. And then students see me do 2 or 3 strokes on here and say, oh, well, you just licked the canvas. And it's important to understand what the difference is between laying down a few thoughtful strokes with intent and mindlessly softening out for 5, 10, 15, 20, 50 brush strokes. I think I've counted some students do upwards of 70 strokes before picking up any new paint. And there's a real difference here. I have a much greater understanding by now, after my years of experience, of how much paint I'm exactly putting onto my brush each time I mix into this color. And I also have an understanding to some degree of how hard or soft I'm laying the paint down and how much that pressure is going to be taking paint off of my brush. And I also have, thirdly, an understanding of how the color that I'm laying down is going to mix, if at all, with some color that's underneath. And so with those 3 things, I have a better knowledge of how many strokes I can lay down of a particular color and still keep the color clean without violating any value structure shifts or losing any edge quality shifts. And that's kind of important. Each of these strokes I'm doing are very thoughtful with intent. I have kind of a plan for how much area, how I'm going to try to manipulate the shape every time I lay down a piece of color. And usually, if I've only laid down one stroke and I go back to pick up more paint, it's because I laid down the stroke and I notice it's a little incorrect and I've gone to modify it. Because usually you can get more than one stroke with a piece of paint. You can get a few strokes, but each time I go to do that, each time I do more than one stroke, it's not because I'm just trying to spread out a color that worked, it's because I have a certain idea for how large I wanted that shape to be, the direction I wanted it to be, how much I needed that color to mix, and potentially how much I wanted an edge to be softened. And that's what's going through my mind with each of these strokes here. And so there's a real difference between that and just repeating a stroke again and again and again and again. And I think it all comes down to intent. What is the intent that you have for the little piece of color that you're mixing? And what are you hoping to achieve when you put that little piece of paint up there? And if you don't know, then you really should only be doing one stroke at a time and then pausing and stopping to think, and then do another stroke and then pausing and stopping to think. And then as you gain more experience, you'll be able to do a little more and a little more. And that actually is the way that I have learned how to paint. It's just that really slow, careful, considerate approach to painting. So I'm going to go in now and try to lay in some darker accents, really anchor that foot into the floor there. And as I lay some of these darker notes in, the lights of the foot will really start to pop out quite a bit. Keep in mind, though, that I'm not just using a generic black for this. It is somewhat difficult to see on our video because the video is keyed to a certain value for us to be able to see the colors in the main section of the painting. But there is quite a bit of color in the stroke I'm mixing. I mean, you can see, at least now on the palette, how red it actually is. And unfortunately, on the canvas, some areas it just looks like a flat dark. And keep that in mind because it's because the shape is so dark. It becomes really difficult to see the color, not just on the model, but on our painting, when the shape is so discrete or so fine, like it is. And this becomes a challenge when you're mixing color and you don't mix carefully enough, or you just see something that's really, really dark and just assume that it's black for the sake of being black. There's always some color in there. And it's, again, one of those situations where if you don't see what the correct color is, you need to either use binoculars or get closer to the model to identify what is the true color and try to infuse that into the little piece of paint you're laying down. And if you don't, then your colors will end up being very, very flat. Your painting will not pop the way you want it to pop. And typically what happens at that point is students try to push the values even further to get the contrast and the pop that they want instead of utilizing color. And then you start to lose your value structure. So you have to be quite careful there to ensure that you do get a decent amount of color in the darks. And then the same is true with lights. Anything that's really, really light, we tend to automatically just think of as white. You really want to try and find the color in that light shape to make sure that your painting pops the way you want it to pop. So notice when I'm trying to go lock into an area to start to add more color, I try to mix a very large puddle that allows me to really see into my puddle of paint quite clearly, to try and match what's on my canvas. And then from there, I modify it with a stroke or two of color to shift it subtly one direction or another. dipped into an umber back there to warm up my background just a little bit. It was a little too blue. And I'll go back and forth with that background as I need to. You know, I really try to think of and encourage students to think of the background as just a supplementing um, element, especially in something like this, a quick study or an alla prima painting. The background color is not nearly as essential to get correct as it is to utilize to put our main subject into the correct color and value context. That's the real importance, I think, of a background, especially in a case like this. It doesn't matter if we got that background color correct. What matters is we laid down a color that forces the viewer to perceive our main subject as being the correct value or correct color. And often in situations, I see students, especially whenever they're having a challenging time with the main subject, they switch back over to the background because it's a large, big, broad piece of color that's easier for them to get than trying to really figure out the correct color of the subject. And so what we end up with is a background that is closer in accuracy of color and value than our subject, and thus our subject looks less accurate. And so instead of getting perfect with the background and like half right with the subject, try to push the color or value as needed in that background to help our subject appear more correct. You know, if you want your subject to look more colorful, maybe make your background a little less colorful. If you had a hard time hitting the correct chromas in a portrait, and so your flesh tones kind of look dead, well, don't paint your background a super colorful color, because then it's just going to make your subject look more dead, more lacking in chroma. So we can instead use this background now to guide the viewer's perception of our main subject. I had noticed that when I recalibrated that background a little bit, the back of my foot ended up looking a little too light, and I need to make sure that I get that same sort of lost or softened edge quality between the foot and the background, and that's achieved by bringing the foot a little deeper and darker in value. So now I'm going in and I'm relaying down some additional color on top of what I have already that's a little bit darker, a little bit richer, and that brings that foot a little closer in color and value to the background, which gives me the required edge transition that I need without having to soften out manually or flick the foot color into the background color. So my brush now is getting smaller and smaller as I start to zero in on a little bit more delicate shape modulation. And I haven't even really gotten to my small shapes yet. Keep in mind this foot is pretty close to life size as I'm painting it. And pretty soon here we're going to get into some smaller detail that you'll see. We'll get a closer, tighter shot on the camera. I'll get into some much smaller shapes where I start to really think about the anatomy quite a bit more, and then we'll soften that up after another maybe 30 more minutes or so of painting, and then we'll go in for some more finishing strokes towards the end of that. So that's kind of our plan that we're following. I'm still trying to get this really overall structure of the foot shape to be correct with value and color. Um, just laying in more information, trying to get little bits of finer and finer information, but still thinking kind of broadly. You know, I haven't softened any edges yet. It's still very much an abstract kind of puzzle piece shaped foot here with a lot of little chunks of visible paint chips as opposed to you know, a more finished, smooth, clear painting. And that's okay. I'm still trying to, you know, correct drawings. I'm taking levels. I'm sorting through shapes and colors here and trying to get smaller and smaller as I go. One thing that I have found is when I need to go lay in a darker, significantly darker shape over a lighter shape, like I just did with the back of the heel, I do anticipate that there's going to be a certain amount of lightening of that shape when I lay down the color. So I typically mix a little bit deeper of a color, a little bit darker in value than I think I might need, so that when I lay over that lighter stroke, it can be lightened up a little bit uh, without getting too chalky or too washed out. So I finally came in and got that little phalange piece on the toe that I'd been lacking before. Um, and I'm really now just kind of working my way into that idea of thinking in terms of anatomy. It was still an abstract shape when I laid it in, but you can see I'm more delicately laying in these abstract shapes with consideration more to uh, anatomical understanding of what's going on. So I'm looking a little bit longer up there to kind of try to understand what I see in between each of these strokes instead of just that quick mix and lay it down and fire away. You know, I'm really trying to get a little bit more thoughtful as I zero in with each of these pieces now. And that's okay. It's okay to slow down with your paint application. I know we do tend to get rushed when we have a limited amount of time with the model, so we really are working with this, you know, super fast mindset. But at some point, we do have to learn to slow down, to pace ourselves, to get careful and observe when we need to get careful and observe, so that we make better decisions, especially as we get more and more towards the end here, where all of these little pieces have to fit into all of the other hundreds of little pieces here and also make sense. You know, it requires quite a bit more sensitivity and knowledge. And this way of working all over and slowly refining it might not be up to your, you know, might not be within your capabilities at this point. I must admit it took me years to be able to mix back in to areas and really be able to mix cleanly on the palette to know exactly the correct color to go lay into an area with. That's definitely not something I could have done the first few years of painting. So that window shading method of painting really worked a lot better for me. Working one section at a time, one shape at a time, and blossoming out from there. Kind of like the historical method of working, of just starting up at the top and then working down a figure painting, slowly filling it in as you go. That sort of careful um approach to painting worked really well for me because it meant that I didn't have to go back in and try to mix a color exactly to lock into an area. Um, so that is a good way to start, and then as your skill level begins to increase, as you start to be able to look up at an area and know exactly how to get back into that area, then you can start to deal with more complex compositions, maybe multi-figural compositions, or just compositions in general that are going to require you to bounce around a little bit more to develop it as a whole. And I think that's more of an advanced method of working. But I do recognize that that is the method that's presented most frequently to students. The idea of work it all over and build it all up together and just target some areas to develop more fully with more detail. I do see that as the common method of instructing students to paint nowadays. And I think the reason that is because students can quite easily lose the idea of the overall relationship of things. As you develop one area out, you no longer relate it back to any other area of the painting, and thus you lose your value hierarchy and your color and your edge hierarchy. So that is why instructors will often say to work the whole painting, build it all up together. So it's good for that, to maintain that idea that everything up here is a relationship that requires us to contemplate it with everything else. It's just really difficult to be able to cleanly and carefully mix back into areas, especially when you're working wet into wet. So it can be kind of a deceiving um, methodology for students who don't have that color mixing ability yet. And doing the one shape out, or the sort of window shading idea of one area and then just working down from there, um, that that will allow you to at least have an anchor set of colors and values and edges to which you can compare everything else off to. That's sort of the backbone of the Alla Prima book that Richard Schmid became so well known for. And that is the way that I worked, and that's largely the way that the ateliers worked in the 1900s, or I'm sorry, 1800s. And then as you develop more skill, you can start to do more with it. Um, you can carefully fine-tune all of your relationships and mix back in as needed. So just don't get discouraged if you're having a hard time at this stage. I've seen a lot of students get to something like this and then not know how to take it to a higher level of finish. That's pretty common, especially with this method of working, because you don't have that anchor area that's all finished that you can key the rest of your painting off of. So that's very common. So hopefully after we see this, what's going to come next here as I get smaller and smaller with the detail and then the softening, that'll give you sort of a clue as to which direction to go from here. Because this typically is about the wall, I think, the roadblock for where students build it up to this point and they just don't really know what to do after. So you notice I went too light in that area, so I'm trying to deepen it back to where it needs to be. So I'm actually mixing right on top of that area that was too light of a stroke, so I can see hopefully what the new value in color will look like relative to the stroke that I just laid down. There, as you can see, there is a certain amount of back and forth to all of this color mixing and laying down. It's treated largely still at this point like the color sketch exercise from first term. And so the level of refinement we're able to do, as opposed to correction we have to do, is based largely off of how close we were able to get in that initial laydown of the sort of color sketch mindset. And if your color sketch, color study skills are not yet very high, if you haven't done a lot of those exercises yet, then you'll probably spend a lot more of a painting session like this, if you're working in this method, just correcting what you laid down color-wise instead of advancing the painting further. So consider that, that foundation is pretty important. Because we don't want to have to do as much of this back and forth if we can avoid it. The best case scenario is we laid that initial color sketch stage down really accurately, and now we're just refining smaller and smaller bits and pieces of information on top of it without having to go back and forth with color or back and forth with value, and instead just get smaller and smaller and more delicate and more delicate. I'm thinking anatomically now. I'm really following the column of that foot with and across the direction of the anatomy there for the column. So now it's time where hopefully I'll start to really build up some structural look to it. All these little chiseled shapes are going to start to be broken down to become um, more and more insightful as to the structure of the foot. All right, now we're going to start to get in some detail now. So this is actually the same brush that I've been working with already. So it's still a fairly sizable brush for the area, but when you have to make more significant changes, it's better to do it with a larger brush. And I needed to go and actually reset the position of a bone. That's a pretty significant change. So I've gone in with a little bit larger of a brush. Our abstract idea of painting will get us so far, but eventually we should bring in this idea of anatomical understanding so that we can make better, more fine-tuned corrections as needed, which is the whole reason why we do all of these. Sorting through the top of that large toe as it feeds into the broad area of the foot. We have a fairly frontal lighting on the pose here. It is a little bit above, but it's hitting, you know, the broad front plane of the foot, which is a very common method of lighting, especially, you know, when we look at the academic paintings of the 1800s. And as a result, what we can tend to see is sort of a sienna-like or umber-like almost outline around our subject. It's not really a true outline, but you can notice where it peaks a little bit darker and a little bit browner almost all the way around. And when we look at academic paintings and even some classical paintings, we'll actually see where they mimicked that just in the initial aspects of the painting where they went over their drawing with a sienna or an umber and they sealed that. So they had basically their line drawing with all of their outlines for their cartoon in that sienna or that umber. And then when they paint on top of that, some of those lines are actually left. You know, they didn't necessarily paint background shape into light shape like Sargent would have painted. They painted up to the edge and they left some of that brown line exposed. And so when you step back, it actually does a really nice yet subtle job of depicting the sort of rounded forms of a person falling away from light and dipping into kind of a half tone darker value. Um, and you don't even see the line from a distance. You know, the transition becomes so fluid and flawless, but when you look up close, you can distinctly see that it looks as though the subject, the figure in the painting, has been outlined with a sienna color. So what I had done with the that edge of the foot there, the top side of the foot going back in there with that sienna, it kind of mimics that quality just a little bit. And a lot of this painting we see of the foot here does have some of that brown surrounding, almost like an outline going around it. At this stage, it is somewhat similar to what this might look like if I were to leave it as an impressionistic painting. The primary difference would be I would have given more attention to variety of um, brushstroke sizes and shape sizes. You know, right now you look at it, there's a lot of great broken color, which is doing some interesting things as far as creating some luminosity. However, almost everything is the same size, and so that can get a little repetitive, especially if we were to take this up to a full-scale painting or full-size painting of a figure. If everything is the same, smaller, kind of slashier brushstroke, then it lacks some of the refinement that makes really good realistic impressionism look realistic, and instead it becomes a little too overly stylistic. And so I would have taken more time, especially initially, to think about larger shapes and broader brushes so that when I get to some of these smaller marks, they start to sing and they become more independent and they stand out a little more and thus create kind of a hierarchy of brushstroke sizes as well that creates a higher level of finish in the painting. Um, that idea that a painting looks kind of like a block-in versus really refined and finished often can come down to this idea of the variety of brushstroke sizes. You know, if everything is the same size mark, it tends to have a very block-in feel to it versus something that has a well thought out variety of mark making. And so that would be the primary difference. If this were to be a more impressionistic painting, I would have thought of that from the beginning. And at this stage, these tiny little marks would start to act as finishing touches. But as it stands now, it still seems a little less organized, a little more chaotic, and less thought out. And so it is going to require me to come in and soften that out and then build on top of it with some smaller accent marks. And then that will achieve some of that idea, but with a different stylistic feel to it. Unfortunately, right now, also, the paint is getting so thick that the camera is picking up some of the glare on these brush strokes, especially in the darks. You know, a lot of the darks strokes are somewhat horizontal, and they are somewhat thick. Remember, I'm not really giving too much special attention to the idea that my darks have to be particularly thin. And as such, those darks are picking up quite a bit more light and giving us some glare. It's creating some harder transitions, especially where the shadow side of the foot at the front of the foot is meeting that darker occlusion. It's reading as a harder edge just because of that paint buildup catching some light. We're going to start to see longer times in between mixing paint now as I try to observe a little more carefully, get a little more subtle with the mixing. Whenever you want to get really subtle with color mixing, you know, to tap into these tiny little steps in color and value, it's going to require a lot more time. I'm picking up on some of the blues and pinks now, especially in the highlights, hitting wherever the skin is pulled really tightly over the bone. The model right now is lit by a white light, but we do have, if I'm not mistaken, at least a window shade open, letting some of the north light come in, and so that's giving us, you know, just maybe a tiniest cool shift to some of the lights. It's not really significant enough to have an overall impact on the warm versus cool, but it is just giving us a tiny little shift in our highlights at least. So notice how long I waited to really begin to paint this toe in. You know, we're an hour and a half into this painting before I'm starting to consider smaller structural shapes like the toe beyond just the overall outline of it. And that's pretty important to consider because often when students are working something like a hand or a foot, and they're not getting it to look quite right the way they want it, they immediately jump into little tiny details of fingers and toes where they've got them, you know, really harshly outlined and typically a little too large and over described. And it actually works to make the foot or the hand look much less realistic because it's that realism is more in the overall shape of the foot or the hand, as well as the structure of the lights and the darks and the main colors. And so if you miss that and you jump right into little tiny anatomical structures like fingers and toes, then it's going to be harder for it to read as correct overall. Remember, the correctness is observed from 10, 15, 20 feet away. So if you lay in your foundation and it doesn't look good from that distance, then it doesn't mean that more smaller detail is required. Because remember, that smaller detail should not be apparent from a distance of 10 or 15 or 20 feet. So that is just a step in the wrong direction by trying to add more information to the drawing or painting when the overall structure is not yet correct. And typically what that does is it works to conceal the problem from the students and make it more difficult to figure out exactly what does need to be changed to be able to make it correct. So consider that, wait as long as you can to start to add those accents in. Work on that structure as long as you're able to before you jump into those finer little bits. It's important also to remember to just step back, even at this stage, or especially at this stage, when we are starting to add in some of these smaller little bits of details. Stepping back is going to help us to ensure that the little bits that we're adding don't have too much of an impact and thus change the overall structure too much. Again, I'm back to actually bigger structural changes with a larger brush. Just tiny little modifications of shapes now. At this point, I'm really just trying to see these last little changes that need to be made before I start to soften things out, kind of clean up the noise, and then go in for some more finishing strokes. You know, things are getting a little soft. I am softening some edges, but I'm really still applying color. So I'm not softening an edge without also laying down more bits of color. But I am coming back and uniting some areas that maybe were getting a little too convoluted with information that was sort of distracting from seeing the correct color. And you should try to overcome any anxiety you might have about that. You know, if you need to obliterate an area by laying some paint over it and making stronger, larger shapes to read a little more strongly overall from a distance, then don't be afraid to do it even this late. And now we're softening out. I have a very clean, very soft mongoose brush here, and my goal is going to be to just work from one shape into another, one at a time, soften it out, and then wipe off the brush, and then select another area and work one shape into another and soften it out and wipe off the brush. I'm never jumping to more than one area at a time to soften things out because I don't want to accidentally lift up color from, you know, for example, this area that I'm working on here and redistribute it in the dark area of the ankle, for example. So I need to make sure that every time I soften, it's just one shape into another shape, and then I clean the brush off. One shape into another shape, and then clean the brush off. Um, and this will keep the color cleaner. It will keep my values much, much stronger. It will ensure that I'm really just softening and not trying to manipulate the paint or the structure of the anatomy in any way. And this can sometimes happen, you know, as you soften things out, like I'm doing here, you're essentially cleaning up the noise like we would in drawing. And when you do that, you start to notice some mistakes that you might not have noticed before. Um, you know, for example, you laid down some color incorrectly, or a transition wasn't happening the way you thought it should, or something. And it becomes very tempting to try to push the paint that you have on the canvas to try and affect the shape as you think it needs to be affected. But I think it's important at this stage, until you're at least very experienced, to try to resist that impulse and just soften the shapes out and then see what it looks like after it's all softened out, and then go back in and lay in some more color and some more finishing touches. Because if we try to push the color here and you don't have enough color, or it's not quite the right color to push around, then you may just muddy things up and you may make a mess of all your values and your color. And so we should instead just try to soften things out as they need to be softened, with the understanding that we'll go back if we need to and add some more information, or fine-tune some of the information a little better to get the effect that we need. These brushes also have a really nice effect of knocking down some of the glare of some of these brush strokes, so it'll be a little more clear to see the color. And that's an important thing to be doing at this stage, especially since I was going in just so thick earlier in the painting. You know, with so much paint buildup, it becomes difficult to see. It's just really distracting. And you could definitely do this with one of the Rosemary Badger blend brushes, the Master's Choice. They'll do a very nice job of all of this softening. The Comber will soften pretty well, but you may be left with some of the claw mark look, which, again, in my impressionistic paintings, I really enjoy that look. You get a lot of nice broken edges with it, but if I'm trying to do something a little more classical or academic or blended, then I would opt instead to use a really soft brush here, so that as I soften this out, I try to mitigate the look of brush strokes in here and instead try to mimic the actual quality of the surface that I'm painting. I don't want to blend things out too much. I don't want it to look too slick or too plastic or wax-like. So I am trying to leave some variation here, um, and not just arbitrarily scrub everything. Um, I do want it to still look like that flesh tone with I don't know, some of those random variations that we get with flesh tone, and then just really observe and adjust the edge as needed to create the transitions and the various undulations in the anatomy. You see, I had accidentally distributed a little piece of dark into that toe. I was able to wipe my brush off and get it very clean and then lift most of that off. And keep in mind the pressure that I have is just very, very delicate, just very, very feather touch. And you might not have that yet without needing to anchor your hand or your brush against a maul stick or a cane. So keep that in mind. If you need to go slower with this, that's totally fine. Eventually you'll develop enough pressure and understanding of how much paint is on the canvas to be able to do this a little faster. But in the beginning at least, it's better to be safe than sorry and just go nice and slow as you do this. You know, on my finished pieces, if I'm wanting more of a quality of a finish like this, I typically come back in the morning with a soft brush and do this softening, but I go so slowly. It can take me an hour or two, sometimes more, to soften everything that I want to soften because I'm just trying to be so clean with all of my transitions that I'm wiping my brush off a lot or using lots of different brushes and just going really slow and methodical over areas of the painting to make sure nothing gets too over blended and I don't lose any color or value transitions. And so that's I think that's really important to note that, you know, if you want this to be really, really smooth and clean, then you really should be going super, super slow. Some of those lost edges in the toes behind the foot there. Notice how I wiped my brush actually on the canvas right before I did that last little bit of softening, and that was actually pretty important. That's to help me ensure that I don't or have not distributed any paint elsewhere on the canvas or on the painting. I'll wipe my brush off, and then just to check it, I'll scrub it on a blank area of the canvas just to ensure that I got that brush really nice and clean. Going in here with a smaller brush now to try and get some of these smaller detail marks. It's still not a super, super tiny brush. You know, we don't really have enough time in a study like this to break out the really tiny stuff if we're working life size like this. So it's still a little bit larger in size, but comparatively much smaller than anything I was working with before. And we're down now to about our last sitting or so with the model. So I'm trying to make the most effective choices that I can make. Remember, as this being a study, we're not trying to necessarily paint 100% of everything that's there. We're trying to get an idea of the foot in this lighting condition in the method of painting that I'm practicing and wanting to learn to develop. So this would be the type of painting where I'm softening things out a little bit more and trying to be a little bit more classical with things, but still going in very directly with the color block in. And this is how I do work with some of my paintings. So this is not an uncommon method for me to use in my own work. So it's good to practice this, and just remember that 100% accuracy relative to the model is not necessarily the goal, um, as opposed to just getting a something that looks very similar to what's up there and believable, and reinforcing the habits of working in this method to try and get stronger at it and better at it. And then a lot of times, especially with anatomy like this, this can be a good guideline as to the level of finish or mark making that we want to introduce into our final piece. Especially if we're going to do something that's more elaborate or complex, doing these anatomical studies will again allow us to sort through how we're going to finish off the major piece, so that as we start to try to get more accurate and put in more elements that have to work together, it doesn't end up getting so overworked that we lose that quality of spontaneity that we may want in the final piece. And so, I do this a lot on my finished works that I really want to appear more direct or impulsive or alla prima. I will do these studies of hands and feet and faces, so that I'm better acquainted with them. And you'll have some recall when you're painting the actual finished painting, going back to this study and remembering what it was like painting the study and what colors you might have used and what kind of gave you some issues, so that when you paint it the next time, you can paint it even a little more stronger, a little more direct, and also a little bit more accurate. If you want to be a really direct painter, especially I think a direct portrait painter, I think this becomes very critical working practice. It's something that someone like Sargent would have done. If you want to keep those final pieces really bold and loose and direct, then you need to do all the figuring out outside of the finished work, and it would be on something like this. I'm laying in more and more information here. I don't think this is even going to be the final, necessarily little bits of information, especially as I sort through trying to get more of the structure of the toe correct. I'll still soften this out a little bit and then go in for the final. But I am just really taking this opportunity to try and push this closer as needed. Lay in with the thick paint if you need to. Make big changes if you need to. We really want to try and have this be as strong of an impression of our subject as possible. Remember, as I go in and get lighter and lighter with a lot of these areas, I'm not going in with pure white. It's actually, even though you can't see the palette, it is an off-white, and a lot of times for some of these accents, I will start with white paint on the palette and actually just tint it so that it's a little more colorful than just a pure white, and that'll allow you to get some of these really, really lighter areas when you need to that still have some color in it, as opposed to starting with a darker or mid-value color and trying to lighten it up. That often tends to kill the color. If you clean off your palette, scrape it down, start with some white paint, and then add those yellows and reds in there, you can get some really nice high value, stronger chromid colors that don't look washed out or chalky. So remember, there's no secret to this flesh tone that I'm mixing. I'm starting with a yellow and a red, getting kind of an orange, and then modifying it with some blue as needed. But mostly it's yellow and red and some white. It's just careful observation. And it doesn't matter what yellow you choose, what red you choose, but for something like the system of mixing I've been using throughout this whole painting here, the more important quality to the color um, is the value of the color. It doesn't have anything to do with the transparency of the color. It doesn't have anything to do with the chroma of the color, really, or how much it's shifted one way or another. It's really just as long as you have a red and a yellow and a blue that's all the same value, and maybe even roughly the same chroma, then it becomes easier to manipulate them in this way. And you can get all of these wonderful, subtle flesh tones just by pushing the volume of red, yellow, and blue a little bit, little bit, little bit, and keeping in mind that overall this is kind of a yellow-orange flesh tone that we're painting in general, so we kind of start with that and then push it one way or another as we need to. Going back to my softening here with my mongoose brush. Note, I'm still trying to make changes here that reflect sort of overall structural qualities of the foot and the form, the major anatomical ideas. I'm staying away from detail, even though the shapes might be kind of smaller shapes that I'm putting in. I'm putting in these smaller shapes with the idea that it's having a big impact on how the overall, kind of big chunk of the foot looks like, as opposed to little tiny details. No freckles, no wrinkles, none of that. Just sort of the overall idea of the big shape of the foot. That's really my main focus. I haven't even really finished the toe yet. That still needs to be kind of resolved and painted in. Because it's just so important to get this overall structure correct. That's what's going to be read immediately from a distance. The toe doesn't actually need much information for the foot to read as a foot. We really want it to have a strong impression of the various forms of the foot, the column and the heel and the ankle. Those are the major ideas associated with the foot, getting all those shapes right and all those roundnesses correct. And those roundnesses are often dictated by color and edge choices. The volumes are often dictated by value choices in combination with the others. It's just all tied together. Shape, value, and edge are just so important, but in color, but none in isolation. You can't do one without the other. Going back in with the background now, carving that toe out. I'm going to get ready to make some final decisions on it. Still keeping my the edges of my shape very straight, and that's going to help me get a better idea of the major shape of the toe, correct? The bigger structure, the bigger tilts and angles. That's all done with nice straight lines. I don't want to get too curved too fast. Again, those curved lines will conceal information from me rather than reveal it. Now we have less than 10 minutes left, and I'm finally going to start to really zero in on this toe. Kind of walking the form right now. I'm seeing where one shape leads into another shape leads into another shape. You can see me kind of trace my brush around the foot without actually painting on it, kind of moving around, and this is it's sort of like taking angles. It's somewhat like triangulation, except that I'm just seeing what is the angle of this shape to the angle of this shape as I flow back over to this shape, and I kind of move all around the form, trying to conceptualize the relationship of each of these little pieces compared to all these other little pieces. And so this is something that I'll do frequently. There's lots of artists that will work in this method, and it just allows me to sort of fine-tune some of these final choices to make sure that the relationship to everything else is accurate. Some artists do it in the very beginning, which it's a great way to conceptualize things. This idea of walking the form, think about how this shape feeds into this shape, feeds into this shape as you move in and out and all around the form. You do have to be a little more skillful at being able to manipulate paint, though, if you're going to be laying down paint while you do that. But even just to take your brush and kind of move it all around, without touching the canvas, just like you would move it around the model. That path and rhythm and timing that you get while moving your brush around the model should be the same as on the painting, and then that can help you fine-tune some of your measurement decisions. Just start laying in some final little notes and highlights now. Last chance to soften things out. Sometimes this can be done even without the model. A lot of the softening. It depends on how much you've been studying your drawing of the anatomical structures and how light and shadow work, how much figure drawing you've done. A lot of this softening can be done just from that knowledge of anatomy and knowledge of light, so that you don't have to spend as much time with the model. You know, especially if you've been looking at the model this long, you should have a pretty decent understanding of how the edge structure of some of these shapes that you've been working on should behave. So I keep wiping that brush off a lot on the blank areas of the canvas, really clean it off. I think somebody we were painting with pointed out how that little white speck was a bit distracting, so I just softened that out with the brush. Again, here I'm not too concerned about the surrounding aspects, you know, the tablecloth that, or the cloth that the foot is sitting on. Really, that's all just to put the foot into context. So I'm not going to spend too much time mixing a whole new color for it, especially as we're nearing the end of our working time with the model. Just keep in mind, even more so than the hand, the overall correctness of the foot is in the structure.